Welcome to Real Estate Resource. Thanks for stopping by. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you'll know when new videos are available. I really hope you enjoy this one. So we're going to continue a little bit where we left off. We're going to talk about a few more forms that are going to be part of the update coming up in 5 days, and a couple new forms that are going to be added. Last week, we talked about the updates to the RPA and to the RLA, to the BRBC, the removal of the SPBB. So again, after next Wednesday, when you guys are writing offers, you won't have to include the SPBB. One thing I do want to talk about right now before I jump into the forms is just something that I see consistently is that the outside agents, I'm going to exclude all you guys that watch the videos and show up on the classes, are still not understanding the process of getting that concession paid by the seller for the buyer to cover their obligation to compensate the buyer's broker. It's like a word salad. That's a very complicated way to say things. But here's the thing. In order for the buyer's agent to get paid, they must have either a BRBC, right, the buyer representation broker compensation, or a PSRA, right, that's the property showing and compensation agreement. They have to have either of those two forms. They have to be dated prior to the showing of the property or same day of the day they showed the property that you're writing the offer on. And there has to be compensation in that representation form, whether it's the PSRA or it's the BRBC, right? BRBC, the buyer representation broker compensation. PSRA is the property showing and compensation agreement. Those two things have to exist, and there has to be an amount of compensation in there. The amount of compensation that's stated in that form, whether the buyer has the ability to pay it or not. So that amount of compensation is the maximum amount that the buyer can get paid. So if I submit an offer to a listing agent and I request at this moment on the SPBB, next week it's just on the purchase agreement. If I request 2.5% and my buyer representation agreement only states 2% or states nothing, you guys would not believe how many BRBCs that we see coming in from outside brokers that show no compensation on there. If it is less than the 2.5, right, it's a 2% or it's a 0. That's the amount that the buyer's agent gets paid. Period. End of story. And for you guys as listing agents, for you guys that are listening, if you're having an issue with this also, you have to submit at least page 5 of the BRBC that shows that it was signed and it has the compensation amount in there. But you could submit the whole thing. But you have to submit at the very least page 5 with your offers if you're requesting for that seller's compensation, right? That the seller's concessions to compensate buyer's broker. Has to have it. You have to. And if I get offers that aren't correct, prior to me even be able to present, I could either call the buyer's agent and say, hey, you need to update this BRBC or PSRA or whatever the form is that they use, because there could be some broker, created one. Or I have to put in my counter. These are the things that I need returned with the counteroffer in order for us to have a legitimate offer to move forward with as a transaction. Okay, it has to happen. Now, for the next 5 days, any offers that you submit, you're going to have to include the SPBB because that's how it does, right? The seller's payment to buyer's broker. That's how it's going to work for the next 5 days. Come Wednesday, you just have to do it on an RPA. But it's like today, I saw a BRBC where there was no compensation in the compensation section, but in additional terms, it said buyer to pay $4,500 over whatever seller's compensation is. That's not a valid BRBC. Escrows are starting to look at those BRBCs now. So you got to make sure they're valid. We had an escrow reject a BRBC that was submitted by one of our agents because the dates were a little screwy and, it wasn't done properly. So these are not just a whatever document. Okay, I get phone calls from agents that are very productive that are like, oh, I showed a property yesterday, so now I need to fill out the BRBC. And then so I said, you did it wrong. That BRBC needed to be filled out before you went in to make that to even show that property. So we've got to take that BRBC or the PSRA. We have to take them seriously, and we have to make sure we're doing the correct steps, because I'm telling you, it is not far off that an agent is going to get paid zero after they complete an entire transaction, because you guys, and I don't mean you specifically that are on here, you guys as general and agents are dismissing the importance of how this works and what the requirements are. So I just wanted a little soapbox before we get into the other forms, that it's really important that you guys understand how this works. Really super important, and that you know how to fill these out, and that you get them signed properly and you get them signed in a timely manner. So you got to start with these BRBCs, and especially with the BRBC. There's no reason for you to not have a BRBC signed, fully executed, and ready to go before you show that first property. And if you don't, then you're doing something wrong, because you're not treating your buyers with the level of respect and professionalism that they deserve to be treated with, especially if they're committing to pay you compensation. All right, let's go. So any questions before I share my screen and we really jump into it? Anybody? Let's see what we have here. If we have an escrow that opened prior to the BRBC going into effect, do we still need to create one? No, because all the terms are, that means the listing agreement was prior to the change. But I mean, that's a long escrow. That's a long escrow. If you're talking about you have an escrow that's been since before August 17th, that's a pretty long escrow. Yeah, Jasmine, go ahead.
What? Okay. Hi, Kyle. Hello. Question. Client has property listed going into escrow. Obviously, he's contingent on buying a property that that seller needs to also buy another property, but it's all going to depend on our closing that our buyer performs. What's the best way to kind of set that up and protect the client's deposit? Because obviously it's going to be like a chain. It's 3 actually properties in escrow going at the same time.
Yeah, it's not uncommon, but whose deposit are you trying to protect?
Well, of course.
Which of these buyers? I don't know. Who do you represent? Just the buyer on the initial down leg?
No, the seller on the seller, the original, the first property, the seller.
Okay, well,
he's going to sell his property.
So right. I understand that. I understand that. So your sale is contingent on him finding a replacement property. Once you find a replacement property, that sale is contingent on him closing escrow on his property that's for sale. I mean, there's a lot of mechanisms to protect. There's a whole video. If you want to go back, I did a video on contingent sales, and you could watch that, and that'll tell you how to handle it.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Anybody else? Any questions? All right. So let's share my screen. Let's see. Where do I want to start here? Sorry. Let's start here. I'm going to share now. And what you guys should see once I do share is the increased deposit addendum. So this is a new form. So this is what we do. So we've gone through it. So if we look at a purchase agreement, for example, and you know what? Why don't I do this? Why don't I just bring up a purchase agreement too, so you guys could see it? Ow. Let me real quick. Sorry, I should have done this ahead of time. Where is it? Okay. So on the RPA, right, and I'll leave this small just so we could see it. It used to have in the initial deposit, below initial deposit. So this is changing. This is next week, right, when these forms come out. Now, when you check off increased deposit, it's just going to include this addendum. Okay. So now, instead of putting in the information, it used to state, when you were going to put the deposit in, how much the deposit was, it had, by default, it was at the removal of contingencies, or if you had to specify a date. Now, instead of putting all of that in the RPA, there is going to be this addendum for that increased deposit and how it's going to be handled, right? So the following terms and conditions are hereby incorporated into the purchase agreement: the date of that purchase agreement, the property address, the buyer's name, the seller's name. Number one, increased deposit. Buyer agrees to deposit with escrow holder in the same manner as the initial deposit. So if I wire the money in, I'm going to wire this increased deposit in upon removal of all contingencies, or on a specific date, or upon blank the sum of dollars, or upon the blank the sum of blank dollars. Okay, I don't know why it has or. I think, or upon whatever. I think I'm confusing myself. Or upon, like, maybe an action's taken. Maybe it's or upon seller removing their contingency of sale, right? Like we were talking about with, I'm going to put the increased deposit in once your contingency's gone, or this is by default is the removal of all contingencies of the buyer. Maybe I could put specific to that, specific to the removal of the loan contingencies, specific to the removal of the inspection contingency only on a specific date, and then the amount. Okay. A combined deposit. The combined total of the initial deposit and the increased deposit shall be blank. Percentage of purchase price. This will fill in on its own, just like it does on the RPA, on the initial deposit. The percent specified is for calculation purposes only and is not a contractual term, just like it says on the RPA. So now what it's going to say is, here's the total deposit that we have now. I put a $10,000 deposit in when we wrote the offer. I'm now, when the contingency removed, going to put an additional $10,000. Now that's $20,000. That $20,000 is, 2.5% of the purchase price. And paragraph 3 states, if the parties agree to liquidated damages in this agreement, they also agree to incorporate the increased deposit into the liquidated damages amount by signing a new liquidated damages clause, form DID, at the time the increased deposit delivered to escrow holder. So there's a form for that DID. It used to be referenced in the purchase agreement. Now it's referenced here. But what it does is it incorporates these new funds into liquidated damages, right, which is on the RPA. So that's all. This is a new form, just changed how the RPA is filled out. Instead of putting, if you're doing increased deposit, I don't know many people that do increased deposits, right? We don't see that a lot. Again, the most common for increased deposit is if the money is coming from a outside source, like a 401k or something like that, where they have to show proof of an accepted offer before they can get access to the money. All right, any questions about that document before I move on? Okay. All right. Next up, let's see. What is this one? This is a brand new form also. So, kind of give some clarity on the situation that this might show up in. So this is a cancellation of agency confirmation and an amendment to the purchase agreement. So let's say that I write an offer. Okay. I have a BRBC that states, 2% compensation from my buyer, but I've checked off and we've looked at the new BRBC. And if you haven't seen it, you could go back to the video from last week and we look at the BRBC where it's changed. They added some verbiage that says, hey, if the buyer doesn't have the funds to pay, so these sales are contingent on a seller paying the compensation, right? The obligation of the buyer to compensate the broker. So we have that BRBC written. We've submitted the offer. The seller initially agreed to pay the 2%. Okay. And then something happens as we get into escrow. There's an issue with the property. They need to reduce the price. They're asking for credits because of some kind of condition. And the seller states, well, the only way that we'll do that credit is if we're not paying the buyer's compensation any longer, the buyer broker compensation any longer. Now, in that case, I can no longer represent the buyer because I'm not being compensated unless the buyer can come up with the funds to compensate me and we can come up with an amount that makes sense and I modify the VRBC, right? There's stuff. If the buyer has no way to pay me at all, I can no longer represent them as long as the seller is refusing to pay, which is their right once you start to negotiate. So if that were the case, the buyer would have to finish the transaction without me. And so this is what this form is for, is to cancel our agency confirmation of how I'm representing that buyer. So this form is intended to supersede the agency confirmation in the purchase offer for the property above, property address there, and what the date of that is, of that RPA, in which John Smith is referred to as buyer, Jane Smith is referred to seller, and then the broker for the listing agent, or the seller, the broker for the buyer. That's Century 21 All-Stars here and whatever, real estate there. Cancellation of confirmation. Buyer's brokerage firm, including any buyer's agent specified in the agency confirmation paragraph or real estate broker section of the purchase offer, withdraws from representing buyer in the negotiation and, if applicable, the transaction for the property above, and will not be buyer's broker, notwithstanding any language to the contrary in the agency confirmation paragraph or real estate broker section or elsewhere in the purchase offer. Then you have the buyer's brokerage firm, which is All-Stars, your name in the buy and the date, your signature will go there also. Then they have, that's prior to. That's just saying, hey, look, you want this? I'm canceling our relationship on the offer because they came back and said, we're not paying anything. That's on the original offer. This is, we're already in the transaction. We've been accepted. So this is to either replace a buyer's brokerage firm, a seller's brokerage firm, or the replacement brokerage firm. So this is like, for example, let's say you get fired. Right, you get fired by your buyer. You guys can't work together. You don't want to work with them anymore. That's what this is for. We're replacing the firm. They're going to go with somebody else, or they're going to go on their own. That's all that means. So it's in the same thing as what we were talking about before. They don't want, you can't represent them. You're not getting paid. You're being replaced. The buyer's broker, and you fill that out. Same thing with the seller. I don't see how that's going to happen with the seller, where the seller's not going to. But if for some reason you want to get out, like maybe you started a transaction where they were represented, but to make it work, you went to a for sale by owner for some reason, you could do the same thing. Buyer and seller acknowledge receipt of the attached disclosure regarding agency relationships. The purchase agreement is deleted and replaced with the attached agency confirmation. So there's another form that shows the new agency confirmation. Buyer and seller acknowledge the terms of the PRBS, which apply to the replacement brokerage firm. Real estate broker section, the buyer's firm, the seller's firm, replacement brokerage firm, if there's going to be a new one, they sign it and everything moves on. Here's all the signatures. So that's if you have to cancel agency confirmation. Now, if, for example, you were an agent maybe that had a transaction that you opened at another brokerage and then you moved to a new brokerage and those two brokerages has agreed, to allow you to transfer, it would be the same thing that you would use this here for transferring that purchase agreement from one brokerage to another. Okay. Let's see. That CAC can be used now in current escrows when it's available if the buyer asks for additional credit for repairs. Well, I mean, this one, yes, you could use that once it happens, though. Once it comes out, which is not until the 17th, you can't use it today because it doesn't exist today. But you've got to negotiate first. So, for example, like she's asking, well, if buyer asks for additional credit for repairs, you still got to negotiate first, right? I mean, you got to say, like, yeah, fine, we'll do the repairs, but we're not going to pay your agent. And then you got to think, how many buyers are going to move forward without having an agent representing them to guide them and to help them out? I don't know that's going to happen. You'll probably have transactions fall out more than you'll have a buyer complete a transaction without an agent, especially at that point of a transaction. But yeah, once the 17th rolls around and this form is in your box, if that's what you guys need to do to remove yourself and to not have an agency relationship, then yes, you could use it. Okay. The contingency removal for seller, they made a change where they added in this section. So in the SPRP, right, when you guys do an SPRP, there is a paragraph, and my mind just went blank what number it is, but where it states that they're agreeing to a certain amount of days for an extension on close of escrow once the seller removes their contingency of finding a replacement property. The way it works right now is that when I send that contingency removal, I also have to send an extension of time addendum, and they have to sign and agree to it, because that was the SPRP that they can't fight you on that extension. Well, now what they've done is in this seller contingency removal, they just added in as permitted in paragraph 2C of the SPRP. Well, there you go. There's the paragraph I couldn't remember. It was right in front of me. Seller elects to extend the close of escrow date for the sale of seller's property for blank additional days or until a specific date. If paragraph 2C of Sierra Form SPRP does not allow for such extension, this notice of extension shall be deemed invalid and shall have no effect on the agreement. So if in the SPRP I didn't already negotiate at the very beginning that we had that extension amount of time for an extension, 30, 45, 60, 90, whatever it is that you wrote in, or to a specific date, I can't do it here and then have them accept it. Like, they don't have to. So you got to make sure that part's done first so that you can do it here. But now what happens is once you send this contingency removal with that box checked, with the close of escrow extension, that's the extension. You don't have to send a separate form for the extension of the close of escrow. Then once you remove this contingency with that extension, you send that to escrow. Escrow now has that extension of close of escrow. I like that they added it here, so it's one less document that you guys have to worry about. But here are your contingency removals, right? The finding a replacement property and the closing on replacement property. Remember, on that SPRP, there are two contingencies. And I think a lot of times people forget that there are two contingencies on there. There's a contingency of selling the property, and then there is a contingency of closing escrow. Now, of finding, not selling, of finding a replacement and then closing the escrow. So you have two. You just have to make sure on the SPRP that you're checking off paragraph 1C, or else that contingency is automatically added in. So you need to do that. So just make sure. But I like this with the seller's contingency removal, that they've built that extension right into the contingency removal. So it's one less form for you guys to use, because I'm guessing that a lot of times people are missing out on sending that ETA along with their contingency removal for finding a replacement property. Okay. Again, contingent sales, if you have questions on contingent sales, the way they currently are, for the next 5 days or so, and this doesn't really change that video. There is a video from a few weeks ago on contingent sales that's already there on the YouTube channel. And if you don't have that YouTube channel, you can email me so you can take a look at those past videos. All right, any questions about this contingency removal? No? All right. So there is a Form 2 that is not new, but I know that some of us are starting to represent more tenants. So this is the tenant representation and broker compensation agreement, which is basically a BRBC for tenants. You need to have this if you want to get compensated for helping somebody to lease a property. So we're not going to go into a lot. I just wanted to bring it up. And it shows here what the compensation is, right? Fixed term lease, it's a percentage of the total rent payments due under the lease, or you could just charge them a flat rate. For a month-to-month rental, a percentage of the rent of, percentage of whatever you're going to say, percentage of the annual rent, of the monthly rent, or a flat rate, okay? You need to have this if you want to get paid, again, for representing a tenant. So here it is, the tenant representation and broker compensation agreement. I just wanted to show it to you guys. Like I said, it's not new. It's from July, but it does exist, and you'll need that if you're repping somebody. You're gonna get paid. We're not gonna do transfer listing agreement. That's if a listing is being transferred from one broker to another. All right, SIP. I just opened the SIP directly into where the change was that they added. And I think also just because we don't have a enough conversation with sellers and buyers on how the seller license to remain in possession works. But the change they added is that the seller has to give access, the seller who is now remaining in possession after the close, with 24-hour written or oral notice. So it's not like a normal lease where I have to give you 24-hour written notice. If I call you in 24 hours, you have to give me access, like reasonable, sufficient. You have to give me access. So you look at it, it says entry: seller shall make property available to buyer for the purpose of entering to make necessary or agreed repairs, or to supply necessary or agreed services, or to show property to prospective or actual purchasers. Maybe they're reselling it. Tenants, people who they may be renting it to. The lenders that want to see it, right? That want to see the property if they want to. I don't know why. Appraisers, any of those people. Contractors. Or to allow necessary repairs and services include, but not limited to, repairs and services required by buyer's lender or insurer. So we have to make sure that the sellers are aware when they move in that they are not the owners any longer, or when the escrow closes, they are not the owners any longer. They are now technically tenants, and the buyers can have access to the property with a 24-hour notice. Period. End of story. Now, if you guys want to try to negotiate something else, that's different. And one other thing I will say about seller license to remain in possession that's not in this form is you guys have got to stop where you say we're not doing a final walkthrough until the sellers move out. That can't happen anymore. Once that escrow closes, the buyer is now the owner of the property. And if they didn't do a final walkthrough and you find out there's some kind of issue with the property, it's a much harder process to get that taken care of. So I don't care if the seller is going to stay there for 5 days, 29 days, or 60 days. Before that escrow closes, the buyer needs to go in and make sure that any repairs that were agreed upon are done and that the property's in the same condition. Now, when they move out and you go and look and they made some damages that weren't there prior to them moving out, that's another story, because that's just the same as tenants. You're going to have to go back to them and, that'll become a civil thing. But you guys have to start doing the walkthrough prior to close, whether they're going to stay in possession or not. And if you're a listing agent, you also have to have a really clear conversation with your seller, because this is a conversation that I had with an agent yesterday, is that the seller is refusing to let the buyer's agent come in to do their final walkthrough. They're in breach of contract. You can't do that. So you guys these are conversations that happen throughout the transaction, not just when you get to that roadblock. It's stuff that we don't think about as agents. We just kind of go through and we think that we've got an offer accepted and we got the price we wanted and we didn't have to do any repairs. But we also have to remind them, hey, by the way, at the close of escrow, 5 days prior to close of escrow, you're going to have to let them in to do a final walkthrough, and these things are going to have to be done. And at that walkthrough, you're going to have to provide them with, these items, which receipts or work orders or warranties for the repairs that were done. And the last thing on the SIP before we move on is this section right here, the keys and other items included. If you don't check this box right here, the seller is required to give keys to the buyer at the close of escrow. So you got to check that box. And if you don't check that box and your seller starts to fight with people about giving keys and doing all that stuff, they're now in breach of the contract. So just check the box. If you're a listing agent and you don't want your sellers to give keys prior to them moving out, then you got to check that box. Okay. All right. Questions about SIP before I move on? Okay. This, just because we talked about the tenant representation and compensation, they added this whole paragraph to the residential lease and month-to-month rental agreement about payment, about compensation. So tenant compensation to tenant's broker. If applicable, tenant agrees to pay compensation as specified in a separate written agreement between tenant and broker. owner compensation to owner or tenant's broker. If applicable, owner agrees to pay compensation as specified in the separate written agreement between owner and brokers, right? That's the lease listing agreement. Owner agreement to pay tenant's broker. In consideration for tenant entering this lease rental agreement, owner agrees to pay tenant's broker as follows: a fixed term lease, this percentage for month to month, this percentage or flat rate. Payment is conditioned on tenant taking possession of the premises or being prevented from doing so by housing provider. Payments made by owner shall be credited against any obligation of tenant to pay tenant's broker pursuant to separate written agreement. And third-party beneficiary. Owner acknowledges and agrees that tenant's broker is a third-party beneficiary of this agreement and may pursue owner for failure to pay the amount specified in paragraph 42B. Payment of compensation out of buyer move-in funds. RPO authorizes tenant to deduct any amount for tenant's broker and housing provider's broker compensation out of tenant's move-in funds, still due under paragraph 5. And make payment directly to tenant's broker or housing provider's broker. Any amount paid pursuant to this paragraph shall be credited against the amount specified in paragraph 5. RPO shall be responsible for any compensation due brokers under paragraphs 42A2 and 42B that are not covered by this paragraph. Tenant is instructed to make payment as follows. So, payment made to tenant's broker, how much, when it's due, housing provider amount, how much is due, and the property manager. So any of those funds that have to get paid, this is coming from the tenant that's going to move in. They're going to pay it when they're going to pay it. Okay. All right. So I just wanted to go there. For those of you guys that are negotiating leases or month-to-month rentals, that will be next week. This will be in there for how everybody gets paid. Okay. Any questions on that? No? Okay. These two forms that I'm going to bring up are just because, I mean, they made some small changes to them. I mean, nothing big. But these seem to be the two form. I think people seem to be confused about things. So I had an agent the other day was telling me that they had a listing agreement and they had used an amendment of existing agreement terms to change I believe the commission amount from the seller that the seller was going to pay us as a broker. And that's obviously not the right form. So if there's anything that's going to change in your listing agreement, so for example, I have a listing, it's going to expire tomorrow. If I go and see my seller today, and I can change the expiration date right here. It's got its spot, expiration date. The expiration date is changed to, I can add 3 months, 6 months, whatever I want to add to it. If we're going to change the listing price, I do it right here. If we're going to change the compensation, we could do it right here. Any other terms we may be able to change right here. Okay. So if I have an existing listing that was already agreed to, now, if I have a listing agreement that the seller hasn't signed yet and we're still kind of going back and forth on some of the terms on the listing, this is not what that is for. This is for something that is already fully executed. If we're negotiating terms of a listing agreement prior to them signing it, I would just do a new listing agreement. If my listing expires prior to me doing this this modification of terms, I have to get a new listing agreement. I can't do a modification of terms anymore because the listing has now expired. So this is only to make changes to a listing agreement between the date it's fully executed and the end date of that listing agreement. Anything outside of those things, if we're negotiating prior to it being fully executed, just do a new listing agreement. If we want to, if that seller wants to continue to work with us after the end date, after it's expired, you have to do a new listing. But in between those two dates, when you get it fully executed and when it expires, you can make all your changes to the listing agreement right here on that modification of terms listing agreement. Same to be said for a buyer representation agreement. There's a modification of terms for the buyer representation agreement or a PSRA, any kind of representation agreement that we may have. This is the same thing. Prior to it being fully executed and after it expires, we would just do new agreements. In between those two time periods, execution date and expiration date, this is what we use to make any changes to a representation agreement, whether that to be the BRBC, the PSRA, or the tenant, the TRBC. Okay? So we can change the expiration date, but it can't be more than 3 months. So if our listing expires, really technically, we would have to do a new one because each agreement can't exceed 3 months. But let's say originally I did a 1 month agreement. If I originally had done a 1 month agreement and now I'm going to change that expiration date to a 30-day because we're working together and we want to continue to work together, I can do that as long as the total amount of time of the BRBC does not exceed 3 months. Okay? Any questions? Oh, you could change it from non-exclusive to exclusive. You can change the property types. You can change the locations. You can change the modification of compensation specific to a specific property. Okay? Everybody signs and we're good to go. So those modification of terms, those are the forms that we have to use if we're changing those agreements. Let's see. And I think, man, that was what all I wanted to show you guys for the existing forms. I mean, there's a ton of other forms, but the ones that I felt like you guys were going to use most often, that's the list that we went through over the last 2 classes. All right, so we'll finish a little early today. I think, what are we? Today is the 12th. Next week is the 19th. We might have one more class before holidays are up. I'm not positive, so I'll let you guys know. Again, if you go to my YouTube channel, if you want to see about contingent sales or writing counteroffers or review the forms from last week, the new ones that were added and updated, or you missed this part of this, or you just want to review it. I think the nice thing about having that is the ability to go back and review. So that way, even like that, like right now with that, where we reviewed how to do quickly, the forms that were needed for a contingent sale. If you have it open while you're writing the offer, you can kind of click back and forth through that video, and I think it will help you guys to not miss items that are necessary. All right. Well, if there are anybody have any other questions before I let you guys go on this shorter meeting than usual. All right. I appreciate you guys being here. If for some reason there is no class, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, enjoy. And I really do, for this whole year, I appreciate all of you guys taking the time to come here and listen to me rattle on, learn with you. Because I ultimately believe that the more educated you guys are, the more professional you are out there, the better it is for the industry, because it starts to rub off on everybody else. So I do appreciate you guys spending, this hour with me every week. And I'm happy that I'm able to help you guys. So thank you. Really, really thank you for being here. Stay healthy, be happy, and I look forward to seeing you guys again soon. Take care.